何?
Hello there, Michael here, and welcome back to a brand new video. And in today's video, we're going to be outside, actually, for once in maybe quite a while. And you might already be able to guess what this video is about just by looking behind me. And if so, congratulations. If not, let me break it down. We all know that I like trains, especially riding them. And if you've been a rail fan for any amount of time, you'll know that one of the best places to do so, especially with heritage steam trains, is at the Strasburg Railroad in Strasburg, Pennsylvania. And today we'll be going over everything: the ride, the experience, the service, the price, the food, and much, much more. So join me as we go over the full ride on the Strasburg Heritage Railroad. So go ahead, put your caps on, and enjoy the ride.
I have been working on the railroad all the livelong day. I have been working on the railroad just to pass the time away. Can't you hear the whistle blowing? Rise up so early in the morning. Can't you hear the captain shouting? 9 o'clock.
But yeah, I'm right now in the Pennsylvania Train Museum, and right back there, if I can just zoom in properly, there's an actual steamer train giving our rides today.
Which is exactly what we're going to be doing. And our quest today begins where you might expect, the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania, which just so happens to be right across the street from the Strasburg Railroad. And this museum needs no introduction, as it has one of the largest antique rolling stock collections in the entire country, as well as having one-of-a-kind and/or almost extinct locomotives. Most notably, it is home to one of 2 remaining Pennsylvania Railroad K4 class Pacifics, with the other one currently undergoing operational restoration in Altoona, Pennsylvania. And with many more awesome locomotives, this museum most definitely deserves its own video sometime in the future. Anyway, we're getting a bit sidetracked, pun not intended. Now let's go ride some trains. Now we arrived about an hour before departure, which is the norm for these steam excursions, with our train supposed to depart at 3 o'clock. And our train arrived back just in time at 2:45. And boarding began almost immediately after everybody who had previously been on the train was offloaded. And I stuck around a little bit longer outside to see the locomotive turning around to compile with the other shots I got of it doing exactly that on the previous train. And speaking of those shots, here's a full montage of them. Finally, before boarding the train, I caught a glimpse of Thomas the Train sitting inside the shed, which is actually a bit of a sneak peek for a video coming to the channel around October. Anyway, enough getting sidetracked, but intended this time, time to board our train. We then chose our table and sat down for the 45-minute adventure. The waitress came over almost immediately to take our food orders since we had paid for the dining car, which specs we'll get into a bit later. To start, we were each given a drink of our choice, with me getting some very bussin' cold sweet tea. And not long after, we got our food. I just simply ordered a hot dog, but every meal does come with exclusive chips and a nice little chocolate chip cookie. And before we knew it, we were pulling out of the station right on time at 3:01.
Released this afternoon.
Just beyond this first railroad crossing, we can see the Red Caboose Motel, a very interesting motel where every room is a refurbished caboose. And they have all sorts of antique cabooses too, like ones from the PRR, Conrail, and even Lionel. And now it is finally time to try out our hot dog. I also added some more shredded pork on top because you can never have too much meat in your mouth. And while we're here chowing down our hot dog, let's talk a little bit more about the history of the Strasburg Railroad and the locomotive pulling us. It all started in 1831 when the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad began construction of their 82-mile main line running from Philadelphia to Columbia, Pennsylvania. And the construction of this line would mean a great deal of economic growth for the small town of Strasburg. However, it turned out that this line would actually be circumnavigating Strasburg by about 5 miles. And that just wouldn't do. So in June of 1832, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania granted a charter for the Strasburg Railroad to run from, well, Strasburg to the main line. After sufficient funds were met, the railroad's construction finally began in 1835. The line was completed in 1837, but due to a certain economic event, the progression of the railroad came to a grinding halt, for a while becoming a horse-drawn railroad. Finally, after more than a decade, interest in reviving the railroad aroused, and it became incorporated in 1851, finally purchasing its first locomotive later that year. That locomotive being a second-hand 420 steam locomotive built by the Norse Locomotive Works in an unknown year. It was named the William Penn after the Quaker founder of Pennsylvania and served the railroad well until probably around the late 1850s when it was replaced with more modern 440 American types. It was only uphill from there. Except not really. By 1954, the little railroad had gone through a lot. 4 wars, 3 economic depressions, and the introduction of diesels. And over the years, the railroad's condition only worsened. Not only were the tracks dilapidated, but they were also completely overgrown with waist-high weeds. And as if to add insult to injury, it only hauled just around 200 carloads of freight per year, making just under $3,000 in annual revenue. The railroad was on the verge of bankruptcy and complete abandonment. However, in 1958, a group of railroad enthusiasts, including Henry Long and Donald Halleck, met to discuss the purchase of the Strasburg Railroad to refurbish it. They were successful in their venture to purchase the railroad and spent the better part of a year restoring it. This included fixing up the rails, relaying the ties, and cutting those pesky weeds. Finally, on November 1st, 1958, the railroad reopened as a heritage railway, and it popped off. By 1962, their ridership surpassed 125,000 passengers a year, jumping back to 1960 when the railroad acquired its first heritage steam locomotive, that being number 7312, an 060 switcher type built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1908 for the Grand Trunk Western, later Canadian National. She was refurbished and placed into service on September 1st, 1960. She was renumbered to 31 and continued service until October of 2009 when the FRA took her in for a 1400-day boiler inspection and overhaul. As of now, she is currently undergoing a rebuild and is expected to return to service sometime within the next decade. Over the next 60 years, the Strasburg Railroad acquired many more steam locomotives, such as the Great Western number 90 acquired in 1967, the Canadian National number 89, which is currently pulling us, acquired in 1972, the Norfolk and Western number 475 acquired in 1991, and for a short period of time even operated the Norfolk and Western 611, which we actually rode in a video last year, which you should totally go watch. And after all its rich history, the Strasburg Railroad still continues operation to this day, almost 200 years later, making it the oldest continuously operating railroad in North America. Anywho, that's that for the history of the railroad. Now let's move on to a brief history of the locomotive pulling us. Strasburg number 89 is a 260 mogul type built in February of 1910 by the Canadian Locomotive Company for the Grand Trunk Railway. She was originally numbered 1009, but then later renumbered in 1919 to 911, a number which aged perfectly well in our modern day. After the Grand Trunk merged with Canadian National in 1923, number 911 retained her number until 1951, when she was finally renumbered to her iconic 89. She continued service course all the way up until the end of steam in 1958. She was then placed into storage at Canadian National's Montreal shops until 1961, when a train collector by the name of F. Nelson Blount purchased the locomotive for use on the Green Mountain Railroad in North Walpole, New Hampshire. Finally, in June of 1972, she was sold off for use on the Strasburg Railroad. However, on her way to the Strasburg Railroad, she encountered some minor technical difficulties, mainly in name of her encountering the floodwaters of Hurricane Agnes, where reportedly the water was above her smokestack. She eventually made it to the Strasburg Railroad, but when she arrived, she was in such a state of disrepair that it seemed like this would be the end of the line for her. But thankfully, she was repaired and put into service on the Strasburg Railroad on March 17th, 1973. Later on in the 80s, she was taken out of service for a complete rebuild from the ground up. The rebuild was finished in 1988, with her re-entering service in November of that year. And ever since, she's been happily hauling trains on the Strasburg Railroad, giving people a taste of a bygone era. And here we are back in present day with a fully eaten hot dog. Anyway, it's just about time that we got back to the ride, which was borderline very bumpy. However, I would still say this is good as far as bumpy rides go in the United States. After all, I have most definitely ridden way bumpier trains in my life. But the views you see are more than enough to make up for the bumpiness. The Pennsylvania Dutch country is just so unique in its landscape. The flat yet topographic countryside rolling along an almost grid-like pattern made up of different crops and plant species, with the outlook only broken up by an Amish homestead every now and then. The more geomorphologic hills in the distance coming to a bluish hue, complemented by the partially cloudy sky. Wow, turned into Bob Ross there for a second.
Like those little noises.
Anyway, we are now approaching the turnaround point where the locomotive will uncouple from the train, travel past us, hook up to the back of the train, making it the front, thus effectively turning the entire train around. And there in the distance you can begin to see the electrified catenary towers of Amtrak's Keystone Corridor, a fully electrified corridor owned by Amtrak running 100 miles between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And the sight of those catenary towers marks the end of our westbound trip. After going through a bunch of trees, we pulled out into Lehman Place Junction in Paradise. Yes, the Amish Paradise is a real place.
We've been spending most our lives living in an Amish paradise.
We came to a complete stop, thus signifying the beginning of the turnaround operation. And while we wait for the operation to be complete, let's talk a little bit about the value of today's ride. Now, we paid for the dining car, which is located on the third car away from the back/front of the consist. And this will grant you food which you have to prepay for, and nice wooden tables with moving wooden chairs for wheelchair accessibility. And as for the price, it is $24 per person over 12 years old, with $20 on top for the meal selection. Children aged 2 to 11 are $16 for the train ride, with another $12.75 for the kids menu meal selection. And with all that in mind, meaning that we paid around $150 for 3 adults and 1 child. Now, as for the bang for your buckness of the dining car, I'll get back to that just as soon as we finish covering first class. First class is situated on the 2 cars in the front/back of the train, and this will grant you the utmost comfort, with the first car including velvet couches all the way down it, along with some movable chairs at one end and a confection and beverage stand. As for the second car, it is just as fancy, consisting of velvet armchairs running the entire length of the car. But now it is time for the price, of which it is $35 per person over 2 years old, and you will have to buy your own concessions during the course of the ride. But before we get into detail on what I think of the value, let's quickly talk about the most affordable option on the train, and that being coach and open air. And coach will grant you inside pretty average seating, nothing crazier than your standard commuter train. And the open air cars are what you might expect. There are 3 open air cars on the front/back of the train, and this will grant you a full 360-degree view of the passing countryside and hard wooded seats. Oh, would you look at that? There's number 89 coming past us to recouple with the other end of the train. Anyway, let's get back to the details. The price for regular inside coach is $24 per person over 12 years old, with it being $16 per person from 2 to 11 years old. As for the open air cars, it is $26 per person over 12 years old, with it being $18 per person from 2 to 11 years old. And now, after going over every possible option, I would say, for me at least, it's between the open air and dining car. Let's start with the dining car. First of all, it is air conditioned, which is absolutely overpowered during the summer. summer. On the other hand, there's no powered air conditioning on the open air cars, but you do get cooled off through natural means. However, you do not get purchase concessions on the open air cars and are expected to bring your own if you want any. But for the dining car, it is literally in the name dining car, so you get your own prepaid concessions and food. But most importantly is the price. As I mentioned earlier, it was around $150 for all 4 of us to get the dining car. On the flip side, if we had chosen the open air cars, we would have paid around $90 for all 4 of us. So in the end, it really all comes down to experience and air conditioning. In the dining car, you get a much more private experience with food and air conditioning. But in the open air cars, it's a much more open experience with no air conditioning and your own food. But now it has come to my final decision. Although I do think I enjoyed the dining car more, I'm gonna have to give this one to the open air. It's a good deal, the viewing is amazing, and on the westbound trip, you even get to see your locomotive pulling you. But anyway, those are just my thoughts. You can pick any option you want that best suits you. But now, the coupling operation is complete, and it's now time for us to leave Lehman Place Junction and head back to Strasburg. And now, I think it's time for me to sit back, eat my chips, and let you guys take in the beautiful views of the Pennsylvania Dutch country. And just like that, our journey has come to an end. Now it's time to go chase number 89 one last time before watching her go into the shops. And with that, thank you very much for watching. This has been an absolute joy to make. I really hope that you someday get the chance to visit and ride the train yourself. The experience was simply amazing. that's gonna be it for me, and until the next video, goodbye.